Hello and welcome to the 16th Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy live stream. We have an exceptionally full panel here today. It's so full, we're going to have our own special mechanisms for figuring out who's going to talk next. Let's start from the right, and let's start the most right wing of us all is Trans Revolution. Sophie, how are you doing?
I resent that. I am not the most right wing. I can guarantee you that. And you're a bad person, Dom. Just kidding. I love you.
All I'm saying is that's how YouTube puts the people down here in front of me. You're on the right. YouTube don't lie. They know everything about you. They got your email address and all that shit going on.
We're starting this stream off on a bad foot, Tom. That's all I'm saying.
Fair enough.
That wouldn't be alphabetical order, would it?
That would be alphabetical order. Ah, shit.
Told you.
That's funny. Right. Next we got Puya all the way from let me see if I get this right, Detroit.
Yes. Or pretty close to Detroit, like 30 minutes away. But yeah, I'm what's it called? I don't know, my city.
What?
Well, yeah, it's called Ypsilanti. But yeah,
what? It's called what? Ypsilanti.
Yeah, something like that. Anyways, yeah, reporting in. Good to see you, Tom. And yep.
Thanks for that. Now it's not snowing in where Lexi is, unlike Detroit. Lexi, where are you? Or what are you up to? Or what the fuck's going on?
I'm basically as close to New York City as Puya is to Detroit, with a similarly insignificant town name that I won't trouble you with. And let's see, there's some kind of crazy ass surreal sun shower going on. So I feel like the four horses of the apocalypse are riding in. Feels good. Feels good, man.
Does anybody know that song? Is it the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse? Is it by I mean, you know the guy Vangelis? Is he like something like Greek guy? He was like a 70s band. Do you know that one?
He did all the soundtracks in the 80s.
Green. Yeah. Second one was a red. The third one was a black. It's a fucking brilliant song. It's so shit. Moving swiftly.
I don't know it.
I'll get it up here. Although YouTube will probably strike my account. Let's see if we can get it going while we're talking.
YouTube
over
will
to Kyle.
fuck you up.
They will fuck me up. Kyle, where are you coming from?
I am coming from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, right in the middle of Stampede. And
what is Stampede?
You know, our Stampede is like a gigantic fair / agricultural exhibition / everybody gets really drunk event. And yeah, it's happening. It's my first time here for Stampede, so it's going to be interesting.
Is this like the equivalent of in Ireland? They have the ploughing championships.
Yeah, totally. It's like that, but gigantic.
Yeah. Sounds great.
Yeah.
So, and lastly, here we have Derek Varn. Derek Varn. Welcome back to the show, Derek. How's it going?
Hi, we're on our 16th episode, which is probably the same number as there are Fourth Internationals.
Or as you can see here, not as many as there are Aphrodite's child. Oh no, here we go. Are we ready? Are you ready for this?
Yeah.
Oh
How will you hear it?
I don't know, Tom.
How will I get you to hear it? Come on here, let's get going. Where is this? Oh, it takes a while to get going. All right, let's see. Here we go. There you go. That's enough of that.
Fuck yeah.
That is very.
It's actually a class song.
Yeah. Weird.
Go on, Derek.
No,
It's a
I'm
fucking-
I'm sort of stunned. You know what I said about you being an Irish scene kid earlier? I think I'm doubling down on that.
What scene are you talking about?
True.
This is like 1970 fucking 3. How old do you think I am? God damn it.
The Irish
Yeah,
don't age.
okay. That's true.
They're like
The
vampires.
Irish don't
basically.
age. They are.
Yeah.
But we love garlic, you see, and onions and stuff like that.
Ah.
Cabbage. Right.
It's true,
Okay.
actually.
Enough of this shit talk. We're going to start here and we're going to jump into chapter 8. We've got 2 chapters left. So with this chapter here is called Political Consciousness and International Unity. Now, what's this stuff all about? Well, he gets into a lot of stuff here on why we need a proper international. And also he gets into a whole spiel on a whole load of terribly bad communist political strategy. So with further ado, let's hop in, and I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs here. The question of internationalism as an element of the working class strategy was also critical in understanding the split in the Second International in the subsequent chapters. Sorry, what the fuck?
What's going on,
Sorry,
though?
let me start again. Let me start again. Sorry, I kind of lost how the flow out. The question of internationalism as an element of working class strategy was also critical in understanding the split in the Second International. Fighting for unity of the workers as an international class unavoidably involved splitting with the coalitionist right, which placed and places loyalty to the nation state before loyalty to the working class. The Comintern characterized the Second International's collapse in the face of 1914 as resulting in part from its failure to organize real international unity, and proposed as an alternative a much more tightly centralized and disciplined international. Yet the Comintern was dissolved in 1943, leaving behind the looser common form of communist parties, which, like the socialist parties, were fundamentally nationalist in their strategic horizons. Okay. So what is this common form? Who knows what this common form was?
It's what's left over after the Third International dissolves, and the common form is like basically the formal channels of the official communist parties and the Soviet bloc, and I think some other like European communist parties that were Soviet adjacent. So yeah, I mean, it sort of dissolved. It sort of comes out of the fact that Stalin had trouble maintaining the Comintern with all, I don't know, his calling people to Russia to meet them and then killing them thing that he was doing. So, that's part of this that McNair isn't talking about.
That would do it. That would do it. Okay, let's keep going here with this bit, and then I'll read this and we'll have a chat. The Trotskyists founded their Fourth International in 1938 as a world party of socialist revolution, something in theory even more centralized than the Comintern. In 1953, this world party broke up into 2 competing organizations: the International Secretariat of the Fourth International, ISFI, the predecessor of today's Mandalite Fourth International, and the International Committee of the Fourth International, the ICFI. That's all very clear stuff. The European core of the ISFI has remained relatively stable as an international organization. The same cannot be said for its politics. The current Mandalite FI has become unequivocally an organization like the Second International. That is, it is a loose coordination of nationalities, in this case, mostly grouplets, whose leaders meet periodically and pass diplomatic resolutions. The ICFI tradition has given rise to a bewildering array of internationals: Heliite and sub-Heliite variants, Lambertiste and sub-Lambertiste, Laurista and sub-Laurista, Morinista and sub-Morinista, Spartacist and sub-Spartacist, and so on. Almost all of these internationals are the international fan clubs of national organizations in the main historic centers of Trotskyism: France, the US, Britain, and weirdly, Argentina. My God. Reading that has taken it out of me.
What's funny is I don't think about France as a center of Trotskyism because the dissident communist core after 1968 in France ends up being like weirdo quasi anti-Stalinist Maoism, which is really, really weird. But as a person who technically comes out of a sub-Spartacist split, he doesn't even list all, like, it's funny because I was thinking about the names here, and these have degenerated to the point that, like, we don't even know, like, even someone who, like me, who's kind of a Trot historian, like, I just like the history of Trotskyism because it's so fractious. I don't even know some of these factions. Like, I'm like, who are they the parent of? So yeah. You know what's also kind of hilarious is none of these groups, even in their main headquarters, the U.S., Britain, and I guess Argentina, none of them are like larger than a few thousand people at all. Most of them are probably more like 500 or 600, as we discovered when the ISO dissolved. So yeah, I mean the ICFI has split probably about 32 times. There's like a flow chart I've seen on the internet for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about like the Argentinian case. There was a recent episode of Radio War Nerd on like Perón and like 20th century Argentinian politics, and they kind of get into like why Trotskyists became somewhat prevalent in Argentina in there. So if people want to check that out, it's worth a listen.
Why? What's the short story?
I honestly could not tell you. Like I don't want to be like the one who comes here and tells you all about Argentinian politics when I've just listened to a podcast on it. But it's worth a couple hours of a listen. There's a lot of weird sort of idiosyncratic things about Argentinian politics that kind of led to that.
Isn't it true that like Trotskyism is kind of prevalent in South America in general? Like I don't know a lot about it, but I always was under the impression that like it was partially because, well, okay, so Trotskyism is kind of prevalent in South America and in Latin America generally, and I think part of it was because Trotsky lived in Mexico for a while, but I don't know the details of that. That's just something I've always kind of understood to be the case.
Mexico is North America. Goddamn Americans. That's North America.
That's why I changed it to say in Latin America more generally. So shush up, Tom.
Yeah, I think they.
Go ahead.
Anyways, I think they hate that in South America when you like, or in Central America when you mix it up. Anyways, what were you saying, Derek?
Well, it's actually there's this weird debate whether or not it's Central America or North America because of the distinction with Anglo North America. But to focus it on the Latin American question, a couple of things. Having lived in Mexico, the predominant Marxist groups are either left communist or Stalinist, and are they're anarchist at this point. There was a big tradition of Trotskyism. It seems to have largely faded. I mean, I'm sure there's still some Mexican Trot organizations. In Venezuela, the Trotskyists have some kind of relationship to Chavismo, and were supposedly inspirations for Chavez, although their relationship seems to have faded during Maduro's time. Yeah, I know a little bit about the Argentinian case too. I was also talking to someone from Peru about Peruvian trots, and he was enlightening me that like there's more than Posadist out there, which is the other reason we associate Latin America with Trotskyism. Is Posadism was a real tendency in Latin America. That said, what do you make of how fractious these attempts to internationals become? Because when they attempt to centralize under a transitional program, they almost immediately split. And the other thing they split over is, and it takes to mentioning the British case for me to actually start recognizing some of these names more. The other thing they split over is their understanding of what the Soviet Union was, and it seems so strange that that was the dominating split causing mechanism, and frankly, as McNair points out in the first chapter, all their predictions about what that meant were wrong.
What do you mean by that, Derek?
Well, McNair points out that depending on how you define this ASSR as a bureaucratic collectivism, degenerated worker state, state capitalism, what kind of state capitalism, they all also had a prediction, every single one of those groups, about how the USSR is going to end before 1992. And I was arguing with somebody about this, Douglas Lane, and we came to a compromise position on this. But I pointed out that all the state capitalist people and all the deformed worker state people had theories of what they thought the USSR was going to turn into. None of them was collapse in the capitalism, and none of them predict how it happened at all. And so when people talk about these distinctions now, they tend to omit the predictive elements of them. But that was part of why it was a split-worthy thing, is because they all thought you had to do something specific to redeem the Soviet Union.
Well, I think didn't Trotsky kind of predict that the USSR was either going to go to capitalism or the workers would have to remove a bureaucracy?
Yeah. So that's sort of what I was going to say in response to why there is this problematic deal with predictions and Trotskyism, is that Trotsky's analysis to a degree holds up before the Second World War, because he thinks that the Soviet Union has to either collapse into capitalism or have a full political revolution to socialism. What he doesn't see happening is the USSR sticking around for a few decades as some kind of weird in-between state. And so that sends Trotskyism as a whole as like a research program into a death spiral, because they don't understand how this thing could hang around. And just, we skipped over the paragraph about lutte ouvrière, the French wing, but this is kind of my favorite, actually, the trots that sort of activated me as a Marxist in community college. So I was like, a nationalist-oriented kind of American, and, grappling with socialism. And I would argue with these trots. These trots ended up convincing me that Marxism was, or communism. They ended up convincing me that communism was a worthwhile goal, but they didn't really sell me on that they had a special science about it. They seemed like cranks. But my favorite thing was that they were a break-off of the American chapter of Lutte Ouvrières International. And the reason that they broke off from the Lutte Ouvrière International is over their position on the Soviet Union, which I laughed to myself when I heard that. And they're like, well, their position on the Soviet Union was that Russia, contemporary Russia, was still a very degenerated worker state and therefore should be supported. Putin's Russia. Anyway, just a fun little origin story for me.
I'm actually surprised that McNair doesn't point out that a lot of these anti-imperial factions of Trotskyism defend degenerated worker states in such a way that they actually end up being quasi-nationalist, but never nationalist for their own country, which is different than the Stalinist ones.
Yeah, they become nationalists for Assad or for Putin, but not for America.
There are nationalists. There are Trotskyists that go towards NATO and American nationalism, but those are usually in the sort of like Max Shachtman tradition.
Or they're platypus. I'm getting back in the stack now.
But yeah,
sorry,
I think,
speaking.
On the prediction thing, yeah, I think like a scientific theory, it needs to make it's even a scientific theory. It's hard to make predictions about the future. I think prediction in science is kind of different than prediction of future. Anyways.
Well, I think it's much easier to predict things about the past. That's the way I feel about it. But
You'll have a scientific
joking.
theory about like the velocities of molecules in the container, and your theory will predict the maybe the distribution of velocities, but it might not predict what might happen to the container in the future.
I hear you. I had a little side note on when we were talking about Argentinian politics. I remember reading in The Economist about 10 or 15 years ago about the ex-Argentinian president, Carlos Menem, I think his name was. And he ran a campaign like to the left, and then saying that he wouldn't or they were going to like nationalize stuff, or they would never privatize. And when he got into power, he just privatized goddamn everything he could get his hands on. And they had a quote in the Economist when they asked him, but like, why did you tell everybody that you weren't going to do this? And he said to them, well, if I told them what I was going to do, they never would have elected me. You gotta love Argentinian politics. Right, who do we have next? We've got who's coming in? Somebody wanted to talk.
Me.
Derek,
real quick, because it's related to what Puya said. You have to remember though, Puya, that Trots actually define science differently than everybody else does. They define it based off of like Hegel, and specifically from a Trotskyist, from Trotsky's article "Our Logic and Theirs," and they kind of have a Newtonian like idea of dialectics leads to solid, predictable laws that you can kind of predict the future with, ipso facto, the end. And science has moved on from those kind of predictions. Like McNair doesn't talk about any of this because it's not like he's not dealing with the ideologies involved. He's dealing. I think he is trying to strictly limit himself to the strategy of the international. But I have a hard time doing that because it all ties back. Like the reason why these things are so fractious and they can't centralize is because they try to centralize things that don't even seem about politics, like your stance on what science is.
Yeah, and this comes from just a really, I don't know what else to say it. I don't know how else to say it. And this is a tradition that I'm greatly inspired by and influenced by. But it's a fucking garbage grasp of what dialectics was supposed to mean in Hegel or in Marx or whatever, or however applied. And like, you end up with this like garbage grinder of Hegel into Leninism, where whatever was bad about Hegelianism just gets amped up to like the third degree. And this is true for the Trotskyists that are more sympathetic to Hegel because of things Trotsky wrote, and true of the Stalinists that ended up being very resentful towards the Hegelian tradition, because it sort of presented a humanist challenge of their reading of Marx.
I think it's not just Trotskyism too, because like I was listening to a podcast, and I'm not going to name names because I think they're pretty cool actually, but I was listening to a podcast where they were kind of debating like Marxism as a science, and the people defending Marxism Marxism as a science, I should say, seemed to have that kind of like that Trotskyist sense of like a Marxism as a special science, and it sounded really crank, and I ended up agreeing with the people who didn't identify as Marxists more, although they had their problems. And it just seems to like poison the analysis with all of Leninism, I think. And I don't even know if Lenin himself would have even like been on board with all this, but it's just something I've noticed. Anyway, we're kind of getting off topic.
He was
on
board with all this, but it's off topic and on topic. Can I read this, Tom?
Derek, I was just going to suggest it. Yeah.
Cool. The plethora of international sects has had an effect among the broad layers of activists of discrediting the entire idea of an organized workers' international political movement. Internationalism has, as a result, become reduced to two elements. The first is the effort to promote and or reform the United Nations and the international rule of law. Wherever their intentions, these actually serve to give political support to global US-led capitalist nation states. The second is a fundamentally liberal international solidarity around hotspots in global politics based on moral hatred of suffering and injustice rather than on positive strategy of international action of the working class. These campaigns do some useful work, but led nowhere and rarely reach deeply into the working class. To the extent there is a strategy involved in anti-imperialist internationalism of this sort, it is the Maoist third worldist idea of surrounding the cities, i.e., that the revolution in the colonial world can overthrow the imperialist world order. The present character of the Chinese and Vietnamese regimes and all the formerly radical third worldist regimes all too clearly show the falsity of this strategy. Around the year 2000, there appeared to be a small glimmer of hope for renewed broad international movement in the anti-globalization movement and the World Socialist Forums. But the NGO bureaucracies of the major national parties and unions and the NGOs supporting these movements have combined with the dominance of the anarchistic movementist idea into the ranks of produce a series of no doubt interesting political talking shops. As a side note, McNair's writing before Occupy happens, and we see this third thing ends in Occupy and ends with Occupy. I actually was interested though, because the first strategy about international law, that's been abandoned since like the 90s, right? Like I haven't heard people talking about that.
Chomsky still talks about it all the time.
Yeah, it was
think
popular in
Chomsky's the
academia.
most prominent.
But who in Marx's world still does?
Can someone elaborate on what exactly that means? Like, do they think that like socialist countries need to go into the UN and advocate for themselves? Like, what exactly does that mean?
They think that they could use the UN and the reform of international law to basically set up something like a proto-international. I've actually seen this idea emerge again from some people sympathetic to McNairism in America. The writer of Cold Dark Stars thinks something similar, but particularly around climate change forcing it. But I tend to agree that it would kind of lead too many structures still standing. And I'll pick up on these last two paragraphs. The direct action alternative in the anti-globalization movement has largely represents merely an opportunity for some youth to have the party with the police. After the first media shocks of the 1990s, this has had about as much practical effect of the same militants which were to expend the same energy fighting the police after football matches. As a side note, this is probably the most common form of radical action right now, which is why anytime anybody says anything critical of Occupy, even social Democrats start waving their hands and being like, no, you can't do that. We have to fight the fascists. And by that, I mean some journalists in the streets of Portland, because we won't even attack, I don't know, a militia movement that came there a week before, but whatever. And I just pissed off all your listeners, Tom, but whatever. The root of this catastrophe in the second, third, and fourth international shared a common false conception of the role of international action of the working class in revolutionary strategy, and the variant of the communist Bonapartist centralism, the idea of the general staff of the world revolution. The result has been to produce international sects on one hand and reaction from the proletarian internationalism and international organization, negative dialectical response to internationalist sects.
So that last paragraph. Sorry. Okay. Who's coming in first?
Me, then you, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, I posted that quote about direct action, and I was expecting it to piss off some of my anarchist friends, and it pissed off more Marxists. And it seems like they get caught up in, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like semantical arguments and kind of nitpicking because it just don't like hearing this, which is so weird because you would think these aren't like left communists or anything like that. These are just Marxists, and you would think that they would be on board with this. And I think people just don't like hearing this kind of criticism, even if they are critical of them themselves. You know, and then they also get caught up in like, you know, okay, maybe it was a little bit more effective than football matches, and McNair was having a go, as you might say. But it's still a valid point overall, I think. To tie this back to kind of our discussion of like the Trotskyist sects and these different internationals, wasn't there like some, like, didn't McNair talk about earlier about how like some Trot groups thought that the anti-globe movement was going to be like a revival of the left after like the collapse of the Soviet Union? How does that tie into all this?
They did. They really did. That was why the ISO was all over the place on this kind of stuff. Like they would kind of go in and run like, hey, anti-globalist stuff, but really communism. Also, that was why they took the approach they took the Occupy, except a lot of them have been burnt by the anti-globalization movement going nowhere, so they didn't respond to Occupy at all. That was also true for a lot of Maoist parties too. So I mean, what's funny to me about this stuff is this is all from 15 years ago at best, but some of it, the more you know, when he's talking about the things that are more serious, right? That stuff has kind of gone away, and all you have is like the ghost of anti-imperialist internationalism, except you don't really have them defending actual states, except for sometimes China, maybe. And because you don't hear this about Vietnam anymore, maybe North Korea, which is weird. And then the direct action stuff, which I pointed out the other day that like that Marxist defensiveness literally breaks like 5 or 6 Marxist principles, not just one. Like that individual terrorism is not democratic, that propaganda for the deed invites repression, that it tends to radicalize people rightward, not leftward. Like, and these are things fucking Marx and Lenin said. Like, it's wild how we have dropped that plank as a critique, because I guess Trump is scary, although and every other point where we're dealing with some stuff in Europe and stuff, the people they were fighting were objectively scarier. And yeah, and so I think this has led to all kinds of crazy opportunism, which interestingly enough has actually killed most of these sects, and they've now liquidated into like as like factions within the DSA, but they still function the same way.
Lexi.
Yeah, I was just trying to collect my thoughts on this. Let's see.
Well, I have a question. If you're
Yeah,
while you're waiting, I have a question. Like in the last paragraph there, I've underlined there, he talks about how it was a false conception of having it as a general staff of the world revolution. What is he counterposing as opposed to this?
I mean, he gets to this later on in the chapter. Like,
yeah, okay. Well, do you want to move on then? Or do you want to say something, Lexi?
well, clearly I want to say something, but I'm infirm.
Infirm. You're sick.
Let's see. No, hold on. Let's the reason why people get so defensive about these things is kind of sad, really, is that we're so far away from these debates that all the sides look like they're the same. They're on the same side or something. When in reality, like, you know, McNair really does mean that these things had about as much effectiveness as football riots, because, and this isn't a long-standing Kautskian critique, but also has a little bit of has a little bit of precedent in Marx and Engels, is that there was no institutional, remainder from Occupy, almost as a matter of principle. And for a lot of these World Social Forum things, that wasn't necessarily a matter of principle. That principle came out of frustrations of these autonomous hopes that maybe if we kind of relax our, latent kind of drive to organize and let, the social do its thing, it'll develop some momentum and we'll build towards, the next international, or something. People were hoping for that. at one point. And I don't know, like it's a lot of these things have fallen apart. Doesn't seem like anything works. And so a lot of the classical critiques of, let's say, the general strike or the mass strike, that, in the general Marxist tradition, there was a lot of like pushback to this, pretty like, and now there's not really like a consciousness that like mass strikes would at all be at odds with Marxist institution building or what have you. That's, not to weigh in on one side or the other, but just, Marxists can't tell these things apart because they're so far away from the historical context.
Well, look, Lexi, you may say that Occupy is falling apart and there's nothing left, but look at this. Occupy Wall Street Twitter account, 198,000 followers. Yeah, they tweeted on June the 5th, okay, about drones, and then they tweeted on April the 28th. No, sorry, they retweeted in April the 28th. And
about a nonviolent takeover of frat spaces.
Okay, and then they retweeted on February the 5th. So you say that these things have gotten apart, but I say to you that they live on in Twitter space.
You're quite right.
Ever.
Not even the dead are safe, Tom.
Not even the dead. Kyle.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, like, for people getting into radical politics right now, like a lot of these debates that happen, like going all the way back to like Marx and Bakunin, are just like, aside from the question of the state, like aren't even really like discussed. Like the actual debates that they had over strategy and tactics, they are treated like utterly esoteric things that nobody should bother studying. And you just study the sort of grand theory and then like the big debates over the state. And it's like, there's no actual discussion about this even. Like it feels like I've been studying this stuff for years, and it's only recently that I've actually been able to like hear some discussion about the history of tactics and strategy in the movement. And so it's like, it's easy to understand how there's this incredibly confused sort of perspective about tactics that tends to sort of lump together like various Marxist theories with various anarchist theories with no clear distinctions, and just sort of a lot of voluntarism and movementism. And it's just a complete mess.
To pick up on that note of despair, before we go back to the origins, I think things are even more of a mess right now because of the end of the sectarian model has led to the what I like to coin a phrase that, or maybe Lexi coined it. I don't know which one of us did, but the primitive accumulation of cadre problem, where everything exists just against more people. Because we just need the people so that we can then think about strategies and tactics. And it's been very frustrating to me. And also, socialist education is bad. A lot of the sects lie. And even in books, like I have scholarly books put out from, that were quasi-peer review put out from a multi-tendency, although was a trot press, although who knows what the hell it is now, who actually get facts wrong about, like, say, Kautsky's Verding record in 1914. So you don't even really know what the actual divisions were. They repeat party lies, like outright repeat things that were false. And it's not just Stalinists to do this, it's across the board. The other problem is that, I mean, how many people here, be honest, learn more about socialist history from listening to a historical podcast like Revolutions or reading a straight up history book, even when it's written by an anti-communist, than any of the official, the official theoretical stuff on this history?
Me? Oh, there's no comparison. The kind of qualities of scholarship you get from actual history books, Marxist or not, versus like the canned histories that are associated with sects.
Yeah, and when it comes to like, social democratic parties, like they don't even have the slightest interest in education of their voters, like zero.
Can I go into that for a second, Kyle?
Well, they have a negative investment in.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
If your cadre get educated, they'll get smart enough to leave. So you have to exploit them when they're dumb, or at least naive, you know. And so if you teach them too much, they're going to leave.
Right. Also, students have to learn in other capacities, and students are the basic form of activists because they have leisure time and you cannot pay them.
Is this the Joseph Fritzl School of Politics?
Sort of.
Does anybody know who Joseph Fritzl is?
Nope.
I don't.
You got me.
He was the Austrian guy a few years ago that got found with like a couple of his daughters living in the basement, who he was like
Oh
having
God, yeah, I remember that.
sexual relations with.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Well, that's the most extreme expression of something like that.
That actually has happened with British Maoist groups, not daughters, but like people running.
Yeah, there was one recent.
Well,
Yeah,
Healy,
Oh
right?
no, that
was
kind of shit's
Trotsky.
common as fuck.
That there was only like last year or the year before that one woman escaped from a house in South London, and she'd been in some weirdo sex Maoist cult for the last 20 years trying to get out.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it happens a fair amount. So, but it's interesting because I think for example, the Bakunin Marx debates are way more substantive than I think people realize. And honestly, there are a couple of things that Bakunin says where I'm like, Bakunin's not even that wrong. So that's interesting.
Like what?
Well, Bakunin's stance on the peasants being naturally reactionary, where he says like they are, but they kind of hate the bourgeoisie. Like that's why they appear to central authority, because they don't think anyone else can help them. He's right about that. Like that actually is how politics work even now in China. Like the way the CCP uses rural dissatisfaction, and people forget rural China is still ridiculously poor. They have been strategically left out of the development. They are only allowed to migrate into the cities in very selective ways because there's an internal passport system. And the reason why is they're afraid if they couldn't expand their economic growth fast enough to accommodate them all in the city. That's part of how the Chinese miracle doesn't fall apart, because people forget there's not freedom of movement within China itself. So yeah, this is actually kind of a huge issue, because what that leads to is when they're not really peasants, but when like the agrarian labor force gets angry, even if it's angry at the Communist Party of China, they will take out their anger on a lower level official by appealing to, say, Xi Jinping, which means that the Secretariat has a disproportionately high rural base, even when the rural base is mad at the Communist Party of China. And that still kind of holds true. That's the same pattern you saw in like France and the Vendée. I mean, it's weird. Now, technically, Chinese agrarian workers are not peasants. They don't actually own their land, but you get my point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move it on. Sorry,
Okay.
Sophie, did you want to say something?
No, we should move on. That's fine.
Okay. Sophie, why don't you read these two couple of paragraphs here?
The First International was launched on the back of the campaigns of British radicals and the workers' movement in 1862 to 63 to prevent Britain intervening on the side of the slave owner confederacy in the American Civil War. The immediate moment of its launch in 1864 was an appeal by London trade union leaders to Paris workers' leaders for joint action in support of the Polish struggle for independence. Its activity consisted of a combination of international strike support, both financial and through urging secondary action, with political interventions against national oppression, Poland, Ireland, and against threats of war. The Second International was prepared by attempts in the early 1800s to unite European socialists, but took its real impetus as a movement from the Chicago Haymarket Massacre of 1884. and the consequent struggle for May Day as an international workers' festival. The International was formally founded in 1889 and made the struggle for May Day a symbolic center of its work.
Okay, so McNair is making the kind of give us a historical look back on where these internationals came from, and he makes the case about the Second International that it was largely symbolic in what it organized around like symbols like the May Day and stuff like that, and it was far from this general staff of the revolution. Who wants to read a bit of this next bit? And we want to see Anton on that. We move on.
I can read.
Okay.
Okay. So
Well, everybody, Puya has got something very important to tell us all. He can read.
Yeah.
Well done, Puya.
Oh my
Well
God,
done.
Tom, you're
Oh
so
my God,
sassy
good
today.
man.
You're so
Damn.
sassy.
Damn, leave Puya alone.
I can read. at a
My brother, say it proud.
at a 12th grade level, at least. Okay. The Second International remained until 1900, merely a series of socialist congresses that passed resolutions. Without a leading body equivalent to the General Council of a First International, which could respond rapidly to events or organize strike solidarity. In 1900, the International Socialist Bureau was established. The online catalog of archives held in Amsterdam by the International Institute of Social History suggests, although the IISH's holdings may well be defective, the ISB was proportionately considerably less active than the General Council of Fourth International had been. The First International had been an international of practical tasks. The Second International was, starting with May Day, mainly one of symbols. Why? The fundamental explanation is that its leaders thought that the struggle for workers' power was one conducted within the boundaries of single countries. Following Marx and Engels, that the proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie, Communist Manifesto. It is not clear how far Marx and Engels still believed this in their later lives. After all, in 1864 inaugural address of a First International had asserted that past experience has shown how disregard of the bond of brotherhood which ought to exist between working men of different countries and incite them to stand firmly by each other in all their struggles for emancipation will be chastised by the common discomfiture of their coherent efforts. And Engels, in his 1875 letter to Babel, criticizing the Gotha program, had I think it's Gotha, I don't know, had commented that the German party should be conscious of its solidarity with the workers of all other countries and will, as before, always be ready to meet obligations that solidarity entails. Such obligations, even if one does not definitely proclaim or regard oneself as part of the international, consists, for example, in aid, abstention from backlegging during strikes, making sure that party organs keep German workers informed of the movements abroad, agitation against impeding or incipient dynastic wars, and during such wars an attitude which was exemplary maintained in 1870 and 1871, etc. Okay. Should I keep going?
Keep going.
Okay.
Keep
Yeah,
going.
last little bit.
Okay. However, after the split with the Bakuninists, Marx and Engels had supported the move away from maintaining the international as such in favor of building national parties that organized working class political action at the national level. The logic of this policy, as we have seen, to place a major emphasis on growth and strength of these national parties, ultimately, if necessary, implying the pursuance of a revolutionary defensive policy in war. Okay. Well, it seems like okay, is that good?
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
Derek.
Yeah.
Or
Puya,
Go ahead.
what do you have to say?
Oh yeah, it seems like McNair really is advocating for internationalism here. he's going full gun ho. And go ahead, Derek. You probably have some stuff to say.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the fact that this actually does kind of indicate that some of the problem comes from trying to figure out what Marx's and Engels's later stance is, because the focus on one's national bourgeoisie, which is cited by a lot of like official anti-imperialists, and even like leads to Maoists coming up with theories about like comprador, bourgeoisie, so favoring your national bourgeoisie over the international bourgeoisie, etc. You can get that from a pretty broad reading of the manifesto, but later Marx seems to, but doesn't explicitly contradict that. And that's kind of a problem for figuring out what we're actually supposed to see as a Marxist international program. Because it's really different what he says. And also, like, some of the implications. The other thing is that line from the manifesto gets tied back to like one statement, actually in the labor notes section, which I don't want to go into. That's a long debate that I want to avoid. Of the critique of the Goethe program about bourgeois structure still existing in the transitional form of socialism. And you add those two things together, and you get like all kinds of like this, like, well, it is okay to support your national bourgeoisie in your third world socialist revolution, even though so far every time you do that, it either leads to a caudillo, a military takeover, or to corporate takeovers, where you have different competing factions vying for your resources, even if that competing faction is theoretically a communist country like China, and theoretically it's pretty hard there. Lexi or Puya?
Yeah, but there's some places where Marx definitely advocates, where he states the necessity for international, an international movement. Like in the German ideology, there's definitely a point where he talks about the necessity of a socialist system being international, and
no one's arguing, but the thing is, no one would argue that they weren't being international. They're arguing about the time frame. Like, do you have to develop your productive capacities with your national bourgeoisie first? Honestly, like China's its current NEP on crack it's based off of that theory. Like, they do actually have a Marxist rationale for it.
I think Marx thought the time frame would be at least in that book, he said that, I think there's a point where he talks about it, and he says, all at once, all the revolutions at once.
I think this is kind of not tangential, but this is kind of my take on like what Marx means by internationalism and how to look at it, is that it's important to remember that Marx is a human, and so as such he's going to like change his mind or just like think things through and develop. And I also am in favor of like I just really get frustrated with people who like pit the older Marx versus the younger Marx, because I think it's important to like take a step back and look about how all of his thoughts have developed, right? And so I guess when I was reading this, my takeaway was that you need to organize your own working class and your own nation state before you can even really have a chance for internationalism. Because if we try, so for example, if we try to do like set up an international now, it would just end up looking something similar to the weird Trotskyist sektlet internationals that are essentially useless. So it doesn't make any sense right now. So first you need to build up working class movements within your own nation. And then once there is enough organized workers across, certain areas, in particular around your continent first, then you can organize maybe at first like a continental, as Derek says later on. Or not Derek, sorry, McNair. Derek probably is freaking out about that Freudian slip. But then also kind of in response to what Derek was talking about as far as the national liberation movements and the building up of material, building up of the productive forces and things like that under actually existing socialism, I think that the best way the most accurate way, I should say, to conceive of these national liberation struggles that were done in the 20th century as just essentially a bourgeois revolution. And I know that's going to piss off a lot of MLs and what have you, but that's what they end up looking like mostly, especially when you have Marxist theories of like supporting your national bourgeoisie over the international bourgeoisie. The idea is that you're kicking out the colonizers, right? And I think that aspect of it, of kicking out colonizers, is actually a good thing. And I don't think most of us disagree, although maybe I'm wrong. But it's still even if it's done with the support of the USSR or done with red flags, that is essentially what is happening there. It's a national liberation movement against colonizers for the independence of a nation state. And to build up its productive forces is, essentially what happens under capitalism. Now, it gets complicated with whether or not the, labor theory of value is operative in these countries or not. So it's not like a perfect framework, I suppose. But at the end of the day, they're trying to accumulate capital, build up their productive forces, and do what capitalism does, either explicitly or, through some weird Soviet style.
Yeah, I think the ML take issue with that only because there's a tradition that actually isn't related to Stalin. Stalin actually did have a kind of developmentalist, positive view of bourgeois revolutions, believe it or not. That capitalism is so degenerated that there can be no radical bourgeois revolutions anymore. And also, like, if you say you're a socialist and you win, you are obviously a socialist, even if you don't do anything socialisty, which is the inconsistent standard that we apply. I mean, you get this with like Jusei apologists who will talk about how communist North Korea is, but actually miss that North Korea, like the Kim Jong-un's been so successful because he's actually like NEP'd the North Korean economy and introduced sharecropping to collective labor so the peasants don't starve. And I use peasants there because, well, peasants isn't the right word, agrarian workers, but that's actually a huge issue in North Korea, and Kim Jong-un has navigated that. We don't discuss that in America for two reasons. One, the anti-North Korea propaganda campaign run by our own country, but two, because communists don't want to admit that that's going on there, because it also is a loosening of prior heritage collective agriculture and its liberalizations, and we can't admit there's liberalizations going on in North Korea, and that's why life is getting slightly better there. So this does lead to all kinds of strategic nightmare problems, I think. And whereas the Trots are better about defending bourgeois revolutions as radical. And I mean, I've read like, people who are adjacent to Stalinists, like world systems theorists who aren't Stalinists. I'm not accusing them of that. I like some world system theorists, but I've seen like Wallerstein go as far as say that like he wishes capitalism never happened at all, and that bourgeois culture is totally regressive. And so like that terrain is going through a lot of those people's ideas about how things work, and I think it's really like, I don't think calling a lot of those third world national liberations bourgeois revolutions is even an insult to them, frankly.
And to be clear, I didn't mean it as an insult. That's kicking out colonizers and having independence is a good thing.
I know. I'm just I'm talking to the MLs like more than you.
Fair, and I was talking more to the viewers than to you.
Okay, Kyle, did you want to get in?
Yeah, I just wanted to like talk about this whole question of settling matters of the national bourgeoisie first, and then also that idea of like the comprador bourgeoisie and like the national bourgeoisie, and like I can understand the logic of building a base on a national level, absolutely, but when you look at sort of the actual problems that strategy runs into, it can be like hard to see how you can ever get out of that cul-de-sac. Like, so for example, you know, I don't want to say that like there was any kind of great Marxist theorization behind their strategy, but like just here in Alberta, like what the NDP, the sort of like right social democrats here did when they were in government was very much like, okay, we're just going to focus on dealing with our provincial bourgeoisie. We're going to focus on building up the workers' movement here to some degree. And it led to this like really awful policy of social chauvinism that it really like sabotaged strategizing at a class level for the country. It created a lot of ill will between Albertan workers and workers from other provinces. It fed right into the hands of like right-wing politics that like very successfully created the conditions for the Conservatives to get back into power, because the focus on building up the sort of national bourgeoisie here in this province like didn't make them any more favorable to actually supporting any kind of even like right social democratic politics. So I just like having seen this kind of experience, and then you can point to the more obvious ones like, you know, First World War and so on. It's hard to see how this strategy actually works out in practice.
So I hear you, and it's incredibly complicated. But my thoughts are that the best model we can go off of right now is the early Second International, in that like when you have, you know, like a workers' party or some kind of larger like workers' movement kind of gain a foothold in a particular nation state, you can, and hopefully there'll be other parties that maybe or movements that are maybe not quite as big but are also kind of like rising up. You can start to build an international from there. And then I guess also I kind of like take some of my ideas of internationalism kind of from loosely, very, very, very loosely, but from that quote of Bordiga, I think it was Bordiga, or saying something to the effect that like the USSR shouldn't control the international should be in charge of the USSR. And so and what that would mean is that even though these other countries that are a part of the international aren't socialist yet, you can have the Workers' Party internationally have a say in socialist policies and in strategy all across the different sections of the international. Obviously, you have to have some protections and respect for autonomy and individual cultures. So you can't just like dictate to different members of the international what they should do, but the emphasis should be put on the international proletariat and the political structure of an international, and not vice versa. An international shouldn't be just a vehicle for the USSR or whatever country has the social revolution first to push their policies onto their members. If that makes sense. It doesn't fully solve the problem, but that's kind of how I conceive of it.
And similarly, like whatever we're constructing, I don't know, like should be a vehicle for the fruition of the workers' movement, or, you know, the proletarian agency more generally, and not the other way around. And this all gets into that ambiguity about what is the party. And Sophia, I'm totally with you, and I don't want to make like an artificial kind of grudge match between the early and late Marx, like the Althusser tradition does. But there is an issue about Marx, at least Engels. McNair is right that it's really the late Engels that gets more deep into the SPD. Marx doesn't really want to like hurt it while he's alive, but has his gripes about it. And again, that's not necessarily what Marx was thinking of by a party. But Engels gets more enthusiastic about the potentials of this kind of party. And he had some reason to be. And then, of course, he had, there's a reason that we can't build the Second International today. It required a certain, it required the workers' movement as it was. And we're stuck in a situation where we have all of this historical baggage, you might say. But and I think, probably all of us here feel like party in some way is necessary, probably probably in a stronger sense than the Marxian notion of party, but maybe not like, but we know we also can't repeat the Kautskian form, right? And it's kind of funny. There's a great Lenin quote, and I know, the Leninist tradition ends up
What do you mean
being
we can't? What do you mean we can't repeat the Kautskian form?
Well, the Kautskian form was based on that kind of workers' movement. And that kind of workers' movement was situated in the construction of capitalism, basically, or the construction of the capitalism that we know, the full-blown capitalism we have today. Like, it was important at that time to have workers' movements that were linked into essentially like the state. And if we were more consistent, maybe we would consider lining up with the state as being kind of right-wing. If we're doing Bismarck, right, we're making the state the guarantor of the workers' movement, as opposed to having something independent against the bourgeois state and against whatever the hell the Soviet state was. But I don't know. I guess the thing is, though, like having like a loose ass tendency, like what Marx means by party, seems like not enough. But we don't have the exact same conditions for forming the Second International's notion of parties. But there's just a great sort of Kautskian outlook that I think was funnily best expressed by Lenin when he was still a revolutionary, that politics is done in the millions, and that like you need some kind of big form. You need some kind of mass form. And I don't know if it'll be political in the sense that the Second International was, but it's got to be big. You can't have a little fractious Leninist, cluster or something. That's not a party.
So to pick up on that, what Lexi says, I'm actually going to go epistemological for a second. And also, I'm going to shit on Optisarians one more time. I've always been fascinated by the fact that the people who talk about the late Marx split and really valorize like the anti-humanism of late Marx also, however, almost entirely get their defenses of national of class collaboration and their defenses of being focused on ideology. All that's early Marx, so they're inconsistent on even that front. Like they're not actually like they mix and match anyway. But that's not so much my point here. I think there is a moment of ambiguity that we have to deal with here. That's going to go back to our tangent earlier about Marxism as a science. The Aristotelian former Marxist, who's now like a Catholic, wrote a book called Marxism and Christianity Interpretation, which barely mentions Christianity at all. It's mostly a history of Marxism. But he talks about the Kautsky notion of laws playing into the Kautsky notion of party. And the problem that he had is all the predictive laws that the Kautsky notion of party was tied to, the further immiseration of the proletariat while it was increasingly skilled, the increasing militancy of the proletariat, even in Kautsky's time, wasn't true. The response to that was largely from Lukács, which was that, okay, well, the orthodox Marxist response is to take the structure of what was good and Engels, Marx, and Kautsky, these laws, and even if these laws are wrong, They have led us to their representatives in history, which is the official Communist Party organs, which are the manifestations of the workers' consciousness. And whatever these party organs say is right. And of course, this leads to the immediate contradiction there, because the official party organs all repudiated Lukács. So he ended up refuting himself. And so that aphora leads to, because we don't know what we're actually predicting and what our scientific program is, we also don't know what our political program is. And it's hard to be strategic when you're that lost. And I think like that is my only fear about this book, is that it glosses over the fact that we're in different social conditions. And I'm going to end by referencing the Brumaire. At the end of the Brumaire, Marx talks about these hanger-on revolutionaries. He was actually insulting the neo-Jacobins and the Blanquists, but these hanger-on revolutionaries who always want to relive the revolutions of the immediate past. And he was referring to people thinking like the commune was like 1848 or the original Jacobin movement, which by that time the neo-Jacobins, they don't have any direct ties to the original Jacobins. It's almost 100, well, not quite 100 years later. It's like 60 years later, most of the original ones are dead. So what I find fascinating about that is like, if you take that seriously, the entire communist movement that we know it for the most part, including the left communists, are rumpists who are attached to prior revolutionary forms and are not that interested in deviating from those and looking at conditions now. And I think McNair's trying to do that, but he also doesn't want to say Marx was wrong on anything. I don't know that I do either, but this does seem to be a real problem. Like, this isn't answered in Marx or Engels and Marx or Kautsky or any of it. Because it's like the two conditions for the conditions for the Kautsky's parties doesn't exist. Two, the Kautskyan predictions of what capitalism was going to do didn't happen. That's a big problem. And most people's critique of Marxism really is a critique of Kautskyism, because the road to power was more read than any Marxist text in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I'm going to step out on that.
And ultimately, the central tension for me in McNair's work is this really like erudite sympathy for Leninism. Like, this was the guy that made it so I could think of myself as a heterodox Leninist for maybe another couple years, you know, because I so respected where he was going with this. And even though, like, I think this book can be taken beyond Leninism probably even better. With the sort of, with his with his commitment to good methodological norms that I sometimes call analytical Marxism. And it's funny that Lukács's solution to, well, Marx, Engels, and Kautsky, they might be wrong sometimes. So, let's do like this one weird epistemological trick. And then, cool, that's cool. Truth just means what the party says now. Great. But more, I don't know. The old ass, like, Marxist dank philosopher guy that I like better is Karl Korsch, who was just like, dude, just like read other stuff. Marxism is like part of the world, and this other stuff is about stuff about the world. Incorporate it. Incorporate the insights of Marxism into, like, the rest of social reality. See what it does. I feel like if you are a revolutionary or pro-revolutionary, whatever, if you don't want to be those weird rumpists fetishizing the old forms, it's not that you'll keep yourself ignorant of history. I think that's a mistake too. It's that you know what to look for in history. You have a kind of disciplined, pragmatic, surgical approach. You have just enough categorization to sort of like make it so that you don't get lost, so that you can see like some central dynamics at play. And, the point isn't to build out typologies there. The point is, to think about what kind of situation you're in relative to what was there in the past. That's all. I don't think we have to abandon revolutionary history. It's inspiring and it's interesting and it's depressing. But we have to rethink our relationship to revolutionary history. And sometimes we act like we're into the great man, even if we repudiate it, you know, or the great moment or this or that. You have to kind of see these as tokens of a type and analyze those types, have a categorical critique these things. It's important. It goes back to some of the most fundamental notions of what it means to be a science in the, like, you know, Western, like, philosophical, Aristotelian, whatever tradition, and, you know, and in the Arabian world as well, is the Islamic world more generally.
Here, here.
Jarek, were you trying to get in? Okay, let's move. Who's that? Puya, say something.
Yeah. Well, I think Derek was talking about like the lowering of standard of living quality of workers as capitalism develops. You know, sometimes you get these predictions in Marx too, and people have like, yeah, I think that there's a lot of this language in like Marxism, and a lot of these claims being made, but I don't think it actually goes against Marx's like economic theory. Yeah, like with you know, you can easily predict wage growth using his economic theory. But yeah, that's all I had to say.
Well, I think that's because like Marx actually tends to work in discrete categories. Like capital is about one thing, and I mean, where you get the really bong rip Marx takes is like the Grundrisse, which is why it's everyone's favorite, like every weirdo's favorite Marxist, because you can get some weird quotes and kind of justify anything you want. It's also where you can really disprove the Althusserians who say there's a hard break and like Marx doesn't talk about alienation anymore. Yes, he does. He does it in Grundrisse. I mean, like, it's just he, you know, methodologically is doing something broader there. I do worry though that I'm actually gonna like contradict myself because I kind of feel like doing that. My only one worry is if we get too much into like the we have to change with the times, which I think we do, but that you can use that as an excuse for like, you know, your socialist fan club chapter of whatever clearinghouse organization you happen to be a member of right now. You know, even though those structures don't have anything to do. I mean, at least in one case, I know I'm being vague here, but like the DSA is explicitly like not structured like a party. It is federated to an obscene degree. You don't even have to agree with its bylaws. Your chapter can apply to have bylaws removed specifically for your local chapter. That's nutty. It's very American, but it's nutty. And so if we're not careful, it can lead to utter opportunism. So we do kind of have to figure out, and the working class has to kind of figure it out too, or maybe on its own, what's necessary and essential, and what is historically contingent. That's not an easy question at all, as this McNair book really illustrates.
Okay, I'm going to move it on here, and we're going to have a go at reading the next little bit here. So this is where he goes on about the strategic problem of the international. Marx and Engels did not much discuss the relation between the national revolutions supposed by the claim that the proletariat of each country, of course, must first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie, and the international character of the workers' movement posed by the Communist League and the First International. Nor did Marx, in his critique of the Gotha program, draw out the strategic implications of his comment that the framework that the framework of the present day national state, for instance, the German Empire, is itself in its turn economically within the world market, politically within the framework of the system of states. Every businessman knows that German trade is at the same time foreign trade, and the greatness of Herr Bismarck consists, to be sure, precisely in his pursuing a kind of international policy. It is commonly said that the generals tend to fight the last war. Well, that's getting towards what you were saying, Derek, about all these sectlets and different people on the left. You know, I think there's great truth to that. 1848 was an international revolutionary wave in which more or less simultaneous national upsurges were obviously part of a common international movement. Marx and Engels fairly clearly saw this experience of their youth as a model for the future revolutionary moment. It did not appear. Instead, the period was dominated by a series of national movements and short European wars. The Crimea in 1854-56, the Franco-Austrian War 1859, and the unification of Italy 1860, the Austro-Prussian War 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which led to the Paris Commune. The defeat of the Commune in 71, the split of the International with the Pecunionists in 1872, and the defeat of the Spanish Revolution in 1873 shifted at least Engels' thinking towards what was to become Kautskyism. The patient work building up the organized forces of the working class, carried on mainly through national politics. In the party of the Second International, this evolved into a clear conception that the working class could take power in individual countries as the condition in these countries became ripe for socialism. Okay, what do people have to say on all that? Anybody?
I agree with it.
Same. Yeah. I mean, I think the only thing I kind of have a minor issue with is the could take power in individual countries as the conditions in these countries became ripe. I don't think that's necessarily true. I still think that, like what McNair talked about with like kind of like a continental block, or at least part of a continent, at the very least like two different countries is important. Or if it is just one country, the international has to have more political importance than that one country dictating to the international, as I said earlier.
I think it pretty much has to be a continental bloc because the Soviet Union was more than one country. I mean, we talk about socialism in one country, but it wasn't just Russia. They had like how their internal trade system worked, even, which was complicated when I was trying to figure out how the fuck the ruble actually worked when it was decoupled from gold after 1932, which is really hard to figure out, actually. So it was.
Did they decouple? I thought they always stayed on gold.
Nope, they decoupled. Stalin decoupled them in 1932.
But they brought it back?
No. Brezhnev.
I'm pretty sure.
No, I checked this out.
I'm pretty sure.
No, Brezhnev pegged the international currency, and this
The
is where it gets
ruble.
the international ruble. Yeah, the internal ruble was not pegged to anything.
Yeah, the international ruble was always pegged to gold, as far as I'm aware, isn't it?
Well, and after the 60s, it's pegged to the pound sterling, which is pegged to gold, so it's indirectly pegged to gold.
But even after the sterling went off the gold standard, and the Americans went off the gold standard, I think they were still on gold.
I think they were back to the. It gets crazy, man. This is a real tangent. This was really hard to figure out how it actually worked because it took me forever to realize that, like, even though they didn't admit that they had two currencies, they had two completely separate currencies. So.
They had three. They actually had three rubles.
Yeah. I've seen it claimed that there was three.
Yeah, there was three. There was the rubles that were on the book sheets of the companies, which weren't transferable.
Right.
They were only like accountancy rubles that didn't trade in any sense.
I actually was pushing back on Doug because Doug was like they didn't have labor tokens, and I was like, internally they kind of did because their currency wasn't pegged to anything. It was
We're way off. We're
But
way,
anyway,
way
we're
off.
way off. I don't even know what that has to do. How did we
Welcome
get
to
off
Soviet Monetary Podcast.
And I think
Wow.
the currency was not like labor tokens because it also circulated between the peasants' economy, so it did circulate to some extent.
Yeah, it wasn't labor tokens because it was internal. It was
Just
not
pay it in
pegged to a
fiat
person.
currency.
Yeah, it was a fiat
Yeah.
currency that wasn't
Just a
transferable on an international market.
Motherfuckers, I was joking.
Yeah.
Let's go back to revolutionary strategy.
It was like I went to when I went to Poland in '98. I was trying to get some zlotys before I went, or złotys, and it was like that. You couldn't buy them outside of Poland. They were a fiat one, but they didn't have an international fucking peg.
Yeah,
Sorry.
We just went on super Soviet nerdery. Can I read this next little section here? The logic of evolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
logic of this evolution must be fully brought out in Kautsky's Preparations for Peace in October 1914. Democracy can only find its best expression in a state which consists of one nation speaking one language. Modern production brings people ever closer to touch with each other. The more inner divisions fall away, the more all members of the state speak the same language, the more intensely economic, intellectual, and political life can proceed. Within this method of production is arising cooperation of the lower classes' intellectual and political life, which means an additional strength to every nation. In the national state, both tendencies combine to strengthen each other. In the state of various nationalities, they come into hostile collusion with each other, and thus have a paralyzing effect on economic and political progress, as well as as all is stronger as development progresses. The nation state here is made not only present, which workers' movement has to face, but also the necessary future of all humanity. And also, it's a single nation. Yeah, that's where Kautsky goes, and it's weird because it is like that's like
I didn't like that.
This is where so for example, in the debates between Lenin and Stalin, Stalin's national policy was originally based on Lenin's national policy, which was a respect for national sovereignty. But it ended up when you had to balkanize Eastern Europe for the first time ever and decouple all these groups that have been historically together, and then that actually increased national tensions. And when that happened, which is what he predicted, which is I'm going to give credit to Stalin for being right over Lenin on something, but which is what Stalin predicted from his experience in Georgia. His answer to it, though, is the same thing as like Benito Juarez's answer to it in Mexico was like, well, we can't have these micronationalisms. It leads to internal hostility, which I think Kautsky is right about. But I don't want to. But
yeah, fuck them. Make them all speak Russian.
Yeah, so let's Russify all of them and like develop this.
It's a shitty argument
and vaguely racist. Response.
Basically, like isn't like ethnoi related to the word for language or something? It's just like
it
really
is
close to the idea. So you basically have to like, in a way, ethnically like monify.
It's ethno-imperialism.
Yeah, it's a very scary argument.
Now it is not like it is not racial imperialism, but it ended up being, I mean, like by the time you get to Brezhnev, it ends up being that way anyway, because like they start doing like every key cosmonaut needs to be Russian, and like the Russian chauvinism, ironically, like doesn't. I mean, it kicks up a little bit during like World War II communism under Stalin, but it really kicks up actually later. It's crazy how this goes out. The thing is, I want to say this strategically. This is still a hard problem. Like Lexi and I go back and forth on what we argue about this kind of. It's one of the points where we're not entirely in agreement with each other, but we don't really have an answer because like both the models pursued by the Soviet Union and the models pursued by China are bad. like decoupling peoples who have been coupled together, even though they speak different languages and have different religions, for hundreds of thousands of years was not hundreds of thousands, but for hundreds of years in Eastern Europe was bad. It was bad, and it did actually increase nationalism and like xenophobia and all this other stuff. But Russification was also bad. And I guess like liberal multiculturalism is kind of a third way here. Oh God, I'm going to say the third way word, but even that doesn't really work. I mean, we see that in the United States, and God, the way it's interpreted in Europe is even worse. So I think this is a problem that like we need to turn to things outside of Marxism, because there is no like Marx, like the tradition from Marx to Kautsky doesn't go anywhere. Like it ends up in a battle between how do you have one mega nation, basically, or do you have a bunch of little nations in confederation with each other, but who have increased tensions with each other, and thus are probably going to be there's probably going to be more ethnic voting blocks and stuff, and like ethnic revenge and all this stuff whenever there's civil unrest, which again you saw in China.
Mega nation, mega nation, mega nation.
Also, I just have to say, like, at one point when Derek was talking, you kind of sound like Seinfeld, like, Russification, what's up with that?
What? What do you mean? Could you elaborate on that?
You didn't hear that? Am I the only one who heard that?
I think
you're the only one. You're the only one.
I didn't hear any Jerry Seinfeld.
It was.
I was thinking myself as Jason Alexander, but damn.
I don't know, the way your voice sounded, it reminded me of Seinfeld a little bit.
Yeah, I get excited and my voice does go kind of slightly higher pitch. Yeah.
Let its policies about the nation fail, Jerry. I'm done. Kyle.
Rescue us.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention like the line that can kind of be drawn here in McNair's argument, right? That this Kautskian perspective really comes out of like the late 19th century experience and like what Engels saw, what Kautsky saw out of that. When Kautsky is talking in preparations for peace about this subject, it really feels like, he's basically talking about like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, right? Like these are examples that he could point to. But just because it comes out of that one period of time doesn't mean that like we need to overstate the validity of this point of view, right? It's because as for all the reasons that have already been mentioned, it's enormously problematic.
Okay, like it just seems to me it's a really bad argument. Like the fact that like bourgeoisie play off different ethnic people or different language groups against each other is not a reason to fucking get rid of different cultures. It's just a shoddy argument.
Also, to pick up on the historical specificity thing, Pua, you want to talk before I say this?
No, but I wanted to ask. You said something about liberal multiculturalism, and what's wrong with that exactly?
It doesn't really. So what happens with liberal multiculturalism is that elements of culture that are actually in contradiction of the economic can't really stay. So you just can't. So like, and there are some, let's say like religious groups or like traditional tribal groups where this really is a problem. Like they cannot function with their traditional society, or us leaving it intact as anything other than costumes, because it literally can't function in capitalism. And while if you're an immigrant from like, I don't know, an already semi-capitalist country, like say fairly developed part of the Middle East, as long as you're not like a Salafist or something, it's going to be pretty easy for you to integrate. So that's how it does work. But like, if you're really truly primarily, if your culture is primarily like from a different time period, you know, a different kind of development, it doesn't work, and it leads to resistance. And so, I mean, like, it's the American idea of the melting pot was sort of like our version of the Kautsky argument. Honestly, it was like, well, we can just melt everybody down and make them Americans, like so like lives aren't lost. But then the multicultural argument is, no, it's like a salad. You can leave, you know, everybody gets to stay intact, but we're all functioning together. And the issue with the latter is it's just factually not true for certain groups because they're just too much at odds with the prevailing society. If they totally abscond themselves and like isolate themselves, like say Orthodox Jews or the Amish, it only becomes a problem when they start voting blocking. But in general, it really can be a big deal. And I think that actually that's part of the reason why stuff in the Middle East gets so weird is some of that Islamist stuff is fundamentally incompatible with capitalism. Yeah, but I think maybe the like North American multicultural model, which is probably best exemplified by Canada, is probably the least bad of the answers we've come up so far. I was gonna say something else though, and I gotta remember what it was.
Why don't you let in? I think
Yeah.
Sophia or Kyle want to respond.
Yeah, Sophia, and I'll think about what I was gonna actually say.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry.
I hope Sophia, I hope you're not going to mute. I hope you didn't mute yourself for your sneeze. Surely we should get to hear the
did.
sneeze.
Do you want
God
the
damn
sneeze
it.
on the recording, Tom? Is that what you want?
I did, yeah.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind next time. Yes. So, kind of also to elaborate on the issue with liberal multiculturalism, particularly in America, but I mean it's really true of like all of like bourgeois society, is that there's always this underlying element of white supremacy that kind of undercuts that, and it's impossible to do away with that racial system without doing away with the fundamental like capitalist system, if that makes sense. So like, that's how you get like this kind of like modern woke culture where like corporations are like making all these woke ads and all that stuff, and yet black people are being killed by cops, and trans people, especially black trans women, are getting like murdered daily. You know what I mean? And oftentimes this violence happens at the hand of the state, and so there's this fundamental tension that the liberalism within multiculturalism can't really deal with, if that makes sense. I felt like I jumbled that up, but
I feel like multiculturalism, it might be an okay way to deal with it. It's like kind of it's kind of like it's kind of like passive towards it, and kind of just like lets it develop through its own ways.
Well,
I just think
go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that like I don't think multiculturalism, like the idea that like for the most part like cultures are not inherently better than each other, I don't disagree with that, but I think what the issue isn't multiculturalism. The issue is that we live in a capitalist society that is based on settler colonialism and the supremacy of people of European descent. You can't like make these two things work together. Like you're either multicultural and different cultures are just different cultures and are not like better or worse than each other, or white culture is better. And no matter what, like no matter how woke capitalism gets, like at the end of the day, white supremacy is still a thing. That's my issue with it.
Yeah, and just to sort of pick up on that point that Derek was making, like in the case of Canada, we just had Canada Day here, and it's like the amount of multicultural sort of like patriotism is still very strong, despite the sort of like rise of like Anglo-chauvinist conservatism as a reaction to it recently. But I think really what you get here is a kind of like settler cultural alliance, multiculturalism as like an accord between all different settler groups, which really excludes indigenous people because, yeah, the indigenous culture is not going to easily integrate into capitalism. So yeah, as you were saying, it's a kind of settler colonial project, that's a major issue with it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of like draw that out a little bit too. Like, when you read an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, I can't remember her name. I always forget her name. The author talks about how in like the late 20th century you had this like rise of like kind of like postmodern multiculturalism as a response like the problem of settler colonialism that just kind of pitted like, oh, indigenous culture is just a separate but equal culture. And she points out how in reality, in top of like these economic contradictions, that's just not historically true. Like the settlers always looked down on indigenous people as inferior and savage. And so when you're just like, oh no, we're all equal now, it's fine. You're erasing not only that history, but also the current status of indigenous people in these settler countries, which is frankly awful. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's interesting in Canada how like it is better than the United States, and yet you still have like indigenous people really like fighting Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau is like, you know, supporting these different like oil pipelines that go through the First Nations lands and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, I'm going to move it along here, I think, unless somebody objects.
All right, I'm going to head out.
No
Lex,
problem.
Oh, wait.
Cheer-
I'm going to head out, guys. Good talking.
Cheers, Puya.
Peace.
are you off?
Yeah.
Are you gone, Puya? Okay,
Bye,
Puya's
Puya.
heading, I think. See you, Puya. The Puya's Liberation Front unite against the fascists. Right. Lexi, you haven't read anything here today. Do you want to take the
haven't.
next section?
Yeah,
I know
let's
it's
do it.
amazing. Put on this. We want your best radio voice. Come on.
All right, I'll take an extra bong hit for you. Okay, we have already seen the underlying problem with this approach. Capitalism is from the beginning an international social formation, and the nation state is, in relation to the world market, merely a firm. The state firm retains liquidity by borrowing on financial markets. These, if they are national in form, are international in substance. This was already true of the 17th century Amsterdam and 18th century London financial markets. An attempt in a single country to break with capitalist rule, or even to significantly improve the position of the working class, will thus be met with withdrawal of credit by the capitalists, leading to an immediate crisis of state liquidity and more general economic dislocation. If a socialist government responds by expropriations, the immediate effect is to break the incentive structure of the capitalist market in the country and increase economic dislocation. In addition, the response of international capital will then take the form of blockade and war. It thus becomes immediately necessary to move to generalized planning under economic autarky. This was the situation of the Bolsheviks in 1918 through 19. It has been repeated with varying results, usually the collapse of the socialist government, many times since.
Keep going.
The result is, in fact, as it was in the former Tsarist Empire, economic regression. Hence, the Socialist Party loses its majority support and is forced, if it is to continue its course. Wait a minute. Go back just a moment. It is forced, if it is to continue its course, to minority dictatorship and increasingly systematic repression. In countries that are not self-sufficient in food, energy, and raw materials, i.e., most advanced capitalist countries, the result would be mass starvation. The socialist government would collapse into a capitalist government far more rapidly than happened in Russia and China.
Okay. So
Yeah.
So there's a lot to digest in that bit there.
Yep.
So he's kind of, why is he getting into this? Is he trying to lay out the problems of just being the nation state and why an international is so necessary? You know, that if you're just an island, you know, a socialist island, and you try and do it yourself, you're going to be under attack by the capitalists all around you and in charge. And so, you know, you're not going to be able to just implement, you know, planning overnight, and shit's going to go bad. And it's going to either lead to a regression or, you know, the Soviet Union, Chinese, you know, hard-ass dictatorial position. So this is his reasoning for why it is so important for an international to be functional. Is that that's what he's getting to?
Yeah, and I think that ambiguity in history, in a way, has been settled by the historical record and by, you know, kind of like game theory. When you fucking run the simulation, every time you try to have your little commie utopia, it could be as big as the former Russian Empire, and it's still going to get blocked by the whole world economy.
Yeah. Okay. Let me keep going. The next bit then too. We're going to read this last little bit here, and I think we'll wrap it up then after this section. We'll see, because we're going for how long? We're going for an hour and 45 now. We'll see how long. Well, we'll see how long this bit takes. You know, if we mill through it, we might do the next section. Okay. The exception that proves the rule is the outcome of World War II. The effects. Oh, before we go on, I want to say something here. Like, yeah. I like McNair, but I think his economic stuff sometimes is a bit wishy-washy. It kind of reads like a gold bug. Like, he says like that the capitalists will withdraw credit, leading to a crisis of state liquidity. You know, if you've got control over your own currency, you can't run out of currency. You know, banks are in effect a state license to create money. So, you know, the causality he has is wrong, but definitely the capitalist class can withdraw consumption, but the state could step in. You know, I think that's just a slight minor MMT.
Yeah, I think any way that you reconstruct the economic logic, the capitalist class just has you by the proverbial jewels every time.
Yeah, they have a lot of tools to use, and more so, it's what international capital can do than your national capital.
And that's kind of what I mean. It's like, yeah, capitalist class.
Yeah, right? It's like, look what the US can do to Iran. You know, though Iran have their own currency and they can print it or do whatever the hell, they still have to sell their goods into the world, and they have to get their imports out of the world. So they can fuck you up that way. I just think the language McNair uses there about the causality is incorrect. Anyway, let's keep going.
Noted.
The exception that proves the rule is the outcome of the World War II, the effects of which stretch down to the 1980s. The deep global crisis of British world hegemony, culminating in World War II, and the particular form from which that war took, yielded the result that the USSR was massively strengthened while remaining under bureaucratic rule. In the ensuing Cold War, there could appear to be a series of national revolutions, but in reality, these were possible because the countries involved, most clearly Cuba, were brought into and subsidized by the autarkic bureaucratic planning system of the Soviet regime. Equally, the US, now hegemonic over the capitalist countries, consciously encouraged social democratic and nationalist reform in capital's frontline states as an instrument to secure them from being added to the Soviet Empire. part of the policy of containment. I like this point. Like you go around the map of Europe and you look who's got the best healthcare and the best social welfare. Sweden, Finland, Germany, all these ones that touched on them. Even Italy were reasonably good. You know, compare them to like South America, you know, or Central America or Africa. No, it seems like absolutely not a coincidence that all of these ones that were on the border with Russia all got the best deal out of capitalism. Okay, let me keep going. The offensive of the working class in the late 60s and early 70s destroyed the policy of containment and led the US to turn to a global policy of aggressive rollback of communism under the banner of human rights. The fall of the USSR has finally destroyed the foundations of the policy of concessions for the sake of containment. The exception is now over. It still proves the rule because it was international events and dynamics, World War II and the Cold War, that enabled the supposedly national revolutions and reforms. Capitalism is an international system, and it's international events and movements that enable radical change in individual states. One little thing I'd like to say here as well is that, like, he puts it down to the offensive of the working class, but nothing to do with like profit rate going down. I think, you know, they're probably all wrapped up together, but it's interesting how everything for him has to be political and not economic.
Yeah, I was noticing that too. That was kind of my critique of the book, is it takes economic role in this out of the situation, like the offensive of the working class in the late 60s and its dissolution in the late 70s. Containment's part of it, but also profitability is part of it, and that's an international system too, and it actually explains things like the financialization of the economy doesn't have a damn thing to do with containment, but it has a lot to do with profitability. And this does lead to a blind spot, and I feel like when I talk to McNairist a lot, they do seem to think of things almost totally in terms of political strategy, as if the economy doesn't exist.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to bring that up too, because like that's also you see that like lack of an economic analysis in the formation of social democracy in Europe as well, because I don't even disagree with the point that like social democracy is related to containment, and that's why you had like the post-war compromise and all that. But you also saw Western Europe with good social welfare programs, in part because of colonialism as well, and then you didn't see that as much in Latin America or Africa as well. I mean, it's tangential, I guess, to the point in the book, but it's, you know, it does kind of point towards a blind spot about economics.
I was about to say real quick, and I'll get back to Stack, that was something else that I noticed, that the Maoists would have an answer to McNair here, but like, yeah, it's containment, but that's really labor aristocracy, and that's really what's going on. And I think in reality, all three things were going on. So,
right,
Kyle, were you trying to get in?
Yeah, I think he's kind of like picking up on like the profit squeeze theory of like why Keynesianism collapsed, or why the class compromise collapsed, as opposed to the falling profit rate sort of idea, right? It's just that working class militancy was so intense in the late 60s, early 70s that it caused a panic among capitalists and incited a political counter-revolution. Yeah, so there I guess there is kind of an economic theory there, but I don't find it as convincing as the one that's about sort of the falling profit rate.
Yeah, that's a lot of bullshit. That's a load of bullshit. I'm only joking. I do think it is bullshit, though. Sorry, I didn't mean your point was bullshit, Kyle. I meant the theory. Let me clarify.
Oh yeah,
we got
no
you.
offense taken.
Although now I kind of wish I said it Yeah, your point is bullshit. That's I do. No, I'm joking. Okay, like I was hoping today that we could get to the answer of, what is this idea for an international, but we've got a lot of stuff to go in this. This is the longest chapter in the book. It's 26 pages, I think, which is like 50% longer than any other chapter in the book. So I think we're going to probably call it a day here. We're 2 hours in, just shy of 2 hours. Is there anything we want to say on what we've done today before we wrap up, before we say goodbye to the chat?
We were remarkably disciplined today. We actually, I know we're not finishing this, but we got through more than we normally did. Like, we've spent 2 hours on a page before.
You got to tell me, Derek, I did like the covers for all the the thumbnails for all the way up to episode number 32 last night, because that's where I reckon it's going to get to. God. I did 16 podcast ones, and I did 16 YouTube ones, because they're different sizes, in like an hour. And I swear to God, I wanted to shoot myself. Fucking dude.
Yeah, he just sent me a text that was like on Discord. He's like, I hate my life.
Like, just wait till we get to the next chapter. Like, that's gonna be slow. God. That's intense.
The Republican. Yeah.
It's the final boss.
Yeah.
The boss level.
That chapter's not fucking around.
Kyle, you listened to this whole series so far, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Fucking hell. Well, I've got one more. I've edited the whole fucking series. So fuck you guys.
You're right.
Yeah, no, it's true.
And this is not easy to edit, I will add, because we fucking talk over each other and go off on weird ass tirades. And
yeah.
I mean, at least all of our weird ass tirades today were actually about communism, as opposed to like pooing.
Yeah.
I forgot about toilet chat.
Wait. When did we go on a tirade about pooing?
What? We talked about Soviet toilets.
Oh,
yeah, communist toilets. Yeah, cockshot toilet efficiency. It's
oh Lord,
it's the best thing out of that book. The best thing in that book.
Oh my God.
There's no chapter. McNair hasn't put a chapter in revolutionary toilet strategy in here. Like this, surely that'll be like,
oh my God.
how one chapter on how closely you should stand next to your comrade, in the urinals.
I don't know. I hope he's a little more autonomous on toilets than cockshot, I guess.
I think he covers that in an article in the Weekly Worker, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, in a 4 article debate with Alex Kalikanos or something.
Holy crap!
Holy crap! Indeed, Derek. Indeed.
No, cockshot's transphobia just all of a sudden makes sense to me because it messes up his toilet scheme.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Is that the root? We found the Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone of bad cockshot tips? Yes, it all comes back to toilet.
Yeah, really good and bad. Everything about that is
like
enraptured there.
Yeah.
Wow, Tom, you've got the dialectical essence of his work.
I'm telling you, like, I do think that like his nom de plume is cockshot. Like, it's not his real name. What do you reckon? That's why he's so.
Yeah. Hope so.
I hope so. Okay, let's go to the chat.
I do think it's actually his real name, though. So.
Yeah, it is. Has anybody listened to his communist fairy tale yet?
No.
I have not yet deigned to listen to that, Tom.
Oh my God! Will we put on a little bit to play us out here? Let me guess.
Well, I suppose so.
It is quite something. It really is quite something. I don't know. Like you people will have to see what you make of it. Let me see if I can get on the speaker here now.
Also, his profile picture looks like dad, like a Republican dad profile picture.
Oh, he's got oxen.
Okay.
It does look like a Republican dad.
Okay, you're ready now. This is called Ruby the Troll.
Oh,
okay,
God.
let's have a little listen.
Oh, God.
Okay, now. With the worst sound quality
Once upon a time,
ever.
there was a small troll called Ruby who lived under a bridge in Killin. Each day, as the sun rose, she would go and have a drink in the river. And then she'd hide under the bridge and wait. And after a while,
I can't take any more of it. Sorry, I had to fucking turn it off.
What the
It's 8.5 minutes long.
Why does this
It's like
sound like a BBC documentary? What the fuck is going on?
Well, it's like a historical. It's like a historical materialism allegory about a troll, but I don't think it actually makes very much sense. In the comments, like people were like going in on him here. Yeah, I don't know. He goes on anyway. It's very well worth listening to. It's 5 minutes of joy. Okay, let's go to the chat and see what's going on here. Who do we have in the chat? We have Benjamin Hanshu, Shane Kaleli, Erica Whelan. Who else? Quite quiet today. Jake P.
Our LeftCon contingent is our LeftCon fans are here so they can yell at us.
Oh shit!
Yay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize Shane would be in the chat. What's up, Shane?
Oh,
Shane's
did you
there.
say?
Ben's there. No, Ben. Erica's always there to call us out for being unfair to LeftComs.
Oh, that's Shane, is it?
Yeah, Shane.
Kaleli. I didn't know
Yeah.
Kaleli was the second name. Ah, yeah. And Gleese586, who has a comment, it's always fascinating that Cockshot, as an IT guy, is incapable of producing good quality audio video. It is true. Like, the audio, he's able to do state planning, but the audio video quality is like he's upside down inside a washing machine when he's recorded it. It's absolutely baffling.
So are you trying to accuse me that he's a von Mises plant?
I don't know. I don't know.
Wow,
you're
that's
like,
some galaxy brain like psyop shit right there.
I don't know. We got to do a Kickstarter to hire Steve Albini to record Paul Cockshot.
Oh, that would be so great.
Yeah, I'll fly Cockshot out to Chicago to Electrical Audio. We'll get the full indie rock treatment.
Fuck
Yeah,
that. We'll get Ray Kurzweil and we'll get the Singularity going. With
All right, that
Cockshot
sounds
and
more
we'll
fun. Let's
sort
do
his
it.
mic out.
I mean, listen, like Kurzweil works for Google. You know, he's got like good sound quality. Everything's gonna be sharp.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we can hook Cockshot up with some class traders. I mean, like that'll work.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I let's not slag him too much because I want to get him back on the show sometime.
I actually was I was about to say I feel bad because I actually do think he's a real communist. A couple of bad hot takes aside, but still.
Yeah, no, I do too. I disagree
Yeah,
with him on many things, but I do think he's
Like
not
most
a troll.
things, but he's.
Yeah.
I think he's
Yeah.
sincere. I think that's actually if he wasn't sincere, it actually makes some things easier. Honestly.
Well, no, that's exactly it. Like, you know, he is not like some kind of Brooklyn hot take factory. You know, he's some like
Yeah.
kind of isolated analytical Marxist computer science guru dude, and like it's such a it's like my own principles kind of hurt here. I would like to just be able to be a nice identitarian about it and be like, he, you know, doesn't really take my existence seriously and thinks I'm some kind of reactionary plant or something. So that's nice. But you're an honest communist in your own fucked up crank way. Like, how do you do that? This is where Marxism gets real Christian, don't it?
Lexi.
Yeah.
Lexi, if you were a plant, which plant would you be?
Ficus.
The ficus. Yay!
Oh.
You got me. Oh my god. This is like a newlywed.
That's amazing.
What the hell is like a ficus? What the hell is that?
I don't know.
Reflecting.
How do you spell it?
FICUS. Oh, Tom, if you ever have a half hour, you gotta look up ficus for Congress. It's one of my. It's the best thing that American documentary tabloid person Michael Moore ever made. He basically runs a ficus plant in like a district in New Jersey and beats the incumbent. Like but they kind of like won't admit it, and they have basically like the government's really embarrassed, and so like shuts the team out, more or less. Like,
Oh my God.
That's our starting point for political theory.
I've been saying that for a long time.
Plants
Like,
are shut out of the electoral process.
Like, listen, I have I have no clue what to do, but I know that this has something to do with it.
Yeah.
Are you basically saying you want to run, Lexi?
I want to run. Oh my God, I am a ficus plant. Is it? If nominated, I would not run, of course.
Do you know, like
you want to run?
Like in England, they have the Monster Raving Loony Party.
Oh my God.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and they have they've had people. They have such fucking brilliant. There's one guy who dresses up. This is the party here. You see, there's a guy who dresses. There's a guy who dresses in a full Black Knight outfit, like out of
God.
Monty Python.
So you have a party where we have a candidate. We have.
I was going to say this is a party full of vermin supreme.
Yeah.
Is this like anti-political praxis?
Yes.
Yeah. It's classic anti-politics.
Is it Lord Such? I think was his name. Yeah.
Yeah.
They had one brilliant one. I must find it. There's one of like this guy, and oh no, I'll get it again. Okay, let's go.
You know if they adopted the pony platform?
The which?
You know that everybody gets a pony. That's the Vermin Supreme campaign promise. If you vote for me, you'll get a pony.
Well, I mean, I think Williamson's like seriousness as a candidate actually is sort of the Vermin Supreme, I feel, but like in the actual Democratic Party. So
yeah,
she's an unironic Vermin Supreme.
Yeah.
You have to really believe the insanity for it to work. I guess if you want to make Evangelion real. I mean, they said Bernie Sanders was going to make anime real, but you didn't know like which anime they were talking about.
Yeah, now we know.
Williamson is going to make Evangelion
that's
real.
100%. It's 100% Eva. Yeah.
And see, and I'm going to
chicken in every crock pot and an Evangelion in every garage.
And I'm going to make Berserk real. That's what I'm going to do.
What about this? Look, this is from 18th of February 1983. Mr. Biscuit Barrel rolls into the Bermondsey fray.
Hell yeah.
Mr. Biscuit Barrel. Fucking brilliant.
This is like if the Yippies went somewhere in America. Like.
Yeah.
Huh.
Oh. Anyway, let's go offline. Thanks everybody for listening.
Cheers, everyone.
We'll see you later.